welcome back everyone. It is now midday and I promise you that we will finish on time at 1 o'clock. I hope you all got to do what you needed to do in that short break, but importantly having that stretch from sitting, and it's good to know that some of our panellists this morning have been on sit-stand desks. So I think we all have to remember our own health as well as what we need to do to lead others. I'm very delighted to introduce Kylie Porter formally on to chairing this next panel, and enabling the SDG transition is a very important discussion. And Kylie, who you heard from at the beginning of today, but she is the Executive Director of Global Compact Network Australia. And during her tenure in this role, the membership of GCNA has doubled. And with over 1.5 million Australian dollars of funding being secured, shows how important that organisations find the work of the GCNA, and also the links to global, which came up in the previous panel about how we're learning from international jurisdictions. And certainly Kylie helps give that connection. Kylie spent most of her career in the financial service sector in Australia, the UK and Singapore, and she is also a member of the Australian Government's Modern Slavery Expert Advisory Group and is the chair alternate for the UN Global Compact's Regional Network Council for Asia Oceania. She holds a Bachelor of Business, Bachelor of Arts and Master of Social Science in International Development. And Kylie is a graduate of the Australian Institute of Company Directors. So Kylie, over to you to lead this next panel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jackie, and for that lovely welcome. So welcome back, everyone. As Jackie said, I hope you enjoyed your break. And in this session, we'll be focusing on enabling the Sustainable Development Goal, or SDG transition. As we've heard from previous speakers, globally investors are navigating how to best align their responsible business practices with broader sustainable objectives of society. So those that are encapsulated by the Sustainable Development Goals. But why are these important to investors? And how are investors incorporating the SDGs into their investment strategies and practices? Many of you would have seen the comments happening in the chat function today about the need to transform our economic system and how financial organisations should be considering both a regenerative and distributive model. This model is also known to many as donut economics, an economic system that is designed to thrive rather than grow. Donut economics centres on the notion that to meet the needs of the planet, where no one falls short of essential components to life, such as food, housing, healthcare, the right to voice opinions, etc., without those needs overshooting the Earth's support system. So things like a sustainable climate, fertile soils, healthy oceans, and regenerative farming. All goals that align directly with the Sustainable Development Goals. To explore how important these goals are to the investment community and therefore companies, it is with pleasure that I introduce our three speakers today. Nicole Bradford, who is the Global Head of Responsible Business at Cbus Super. Måns, who is the Head of ESG Research at Ausbil Investment Management. And Liza McDonald, who is the Head of Responsible Investments at Aware Super. You can read more about their bios in the bio document. Welcome, the three of you. It's lovely to see you again. So first of all, I thought that I'd just start off with a really basic question around what motivated you to integrate the SDGs into your work, and maybe a bit about what your organisations have done to identify and ensure that the SDGs are actually incorporated into your investment decisions. So, Måns, we might start with you.
All right. Okay. Yep. I guess if I was a universal owner, I think it is unavoidable that the SDGs are important for us because there's so many global issues out there, and these cause externalities. But even for us, we're an active manager, so we're an investment manager. We don't need to hold all the stocks in the universe, but it's still relevant for us because these externalities, they will need to be priced in at some point. And I think that comes back to the very heart of ESG integration in general, because it comes down to earning sustainability. So if there is a company that is thriving, or the earnings are relying on underpriced pollution, weak regulation, or things like forced labor, etc., it's not going to produce sustainable earnings over the long term. So there is an obvious link between the SDGs and ESG. So for investors to integrate ESG, I think you implicitly also then have an overlap with the SDGs. So that's part of our motivation. And there's other reasons why I think we as asset managers need to look at it as well. It's not just about asset owners. First of all, you have the SDG as a global agreed framework, right? So that means we see that as a lead indicator for policy change and regulatory change going forward. And Modern Slavery Act, that's a direct link between that and SDG 8.7. Climate change will see more as well. And then I think if you look at the failure to cope with the SDGs or failure to achieve them, well, that's a risk for the whole financial system. But equally, the success of achieving some of these goals, well, that's going to lead to economic growth. So ending things like poverty, well, that's going to stimulate more consumers, etc. And the SDGs, well, they can also impact the cost of capital, and the PRI, which we're all members of, they're endorsing the SDGs, which means they're going to be reporting requirements. I might just stop there, and I'm happy to talk more about how we do things in practice, but I want to let the other speakers also have a chance to explain what motivates them.
Yeah, great. Nicole, do you want to build on what Måns has just said?
Sure, absolutely. And good afternoon, everyone. And it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today. And really building on what Måns has said, just taking this from a practical perspective from a superannuation fund, I'll just talk you through and take you on a journey of how we came to recognise the SDGs as important, and part of that being the Paris Agreement as well. Now, Cbus is an industry super fund with over $60 billion of funds under management, and our members are primarily in the building and construction industry, and we have about over 750,000 members. Now, Cbus as a super fund has a 100% owned property development company, Cbus Property, and for over a decade they've been developing premium green commercial office buildings. And they're now regarded as one of the leading property funds for globally on sustainable construction. And they're a consistent top performer on the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. And they're also a top rated performer in Australia for their neighbours portfolio on their commercial office buildings as a whole. But Cbus Property just isn't about green buildings, and it does take a broader holistic approach to sustainability. Now, given a large part of our members work in the building and construction industry, when Cbus Property was created, there was really a need to be an industry leader on safe work, so looking through a risk lens. And being focused on construction, we also had the opportunity to create jobs for our members. So if they're employed, it helps grow the broader economy, and also helps them to contribute to their retirement savings. So we started to measure the jobs created for our members on Cbus Property sites, and we've been doing that for a number of years now. But our sole purpose as a super fund is to deliver returns for our members. And Cbus Property has managed to achieve all of this above on the sustainability credentials, and also achieve over 15% return on average over 10 years as well. And that contributes to the broader Cbus super portfolio in terms of delivering returns to our members. Now, bringing this into context about what motivates us on the SDGs, moving forward to 2016, following the agreements of governments committing to both the SDGs and the Paris Agreement, our board already had an understanding of both the risk management and the value creation opportunities, the financial returns, and that you can deliver outcomes from your investments, such as job creation, represented by these agreements. So the question for us became not why we should do this, but why not? And from a Cbus perspective, we've committed to 7 sustainable development goals where we think we could meaningfully contribute, because we're very conscious of being genuine. And if you take the goals in their purest of form, many of them are focused on emerging markets. So we think about them more as a broader framework for how we consider the outcomes and the impact on the portfolio from our investments. The broad thematics, though, around the SDGs, if you think about it, it's climate change, the built environment, and decent work and economic growth. And I'll stop there. I'd love to hear from Lisa as well.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa.
Great, thanks, Nicole. And really, thanks very much for having us. I think it's a great session. I'm looking forward to it. I'm going to apologise at the outset. I have some building going on next to me at home. So if you're hearing hammering and stuff, it's not my husband, it's the next door neighbours. So apologies for that. So our journey, I think it's come from, Aware Super has been very focused on how we integrate ESG into our portfolios. And, initially that was really about risk, thinking about risk. And that's evolved over time as we've become more mature, but also, as Måns sort of pointed out, there was a lot of work being done on the SDGs from the PRI perspective, and just a lot of talk around the SDGs. So as we started to sort of refine our ESG approach and think about it, not just about risk, but the opportunity, one of the frameworks that we sort of thought about and tried to embed was around the SDGs. So we have very much focused on how we can do well for our members, as well as doing good for the community, and that's very much part of our investment approach. So as we sort of thought about it, we're also very conscious that yes, they are a set of agreed principles from governments in how they can sort of achieve some of these goals, but so not all of them are investment related. So we took a lot of time in sort of coming up with what we sort of termed as our SDG sort of strategy, and it was building on the responsible ownership approach, building on the impact framework that we had, and came up with some principles around how we were going to approach the SDGs and what they did mean for us. And these were signed off by our board, and it's a set of 9, and it's sort of about identifying investments with a positive impact and that they'll be additive. The themes from an SDG perspective are aligned to our ESG and investment beliefs, but also aligned to our membership. So our members are what we sort of term the carers of the community, the nurses, the teachers, the ambulance. So there's that real connection from our members for some of these SDGs and how we can support them. So we also then sort of, you can go far and wide. We really tried to sort of focus on a strategy, and when we thought about investing in line with the SDGs, of what those themes would be, and sort of set some clear ones. And it's probably much like everyone else, it's around climate change. We know we can invest in the opportunities to support climate change globally, but and we can get into the hows and the whys of how we do it, but affordable housing, gender equality, modern slavery, conduct and culture, and waste and recycling, they all fitted into SDGs and how we thought we could align the focus of our investment strategy. So it's building on that ESG and that evolution to think about impact outcomes and how we can invest to support those.
Yeah, thank you. And that's really insightful from the three of you. So thank you for that. I'm going to incorporate the next question alongside a question that we had from our Q&A function, which was really around an organisation that has heads of responsible investing, but when do we have heads of investment who are responsible? And I think this really talks to some of those key challenges that are associated with incorporating things like the Sustainable Development Goals into investment strategies and practices. We heard Måns mention the Modern Slavery Act, we've obviously, and the Principles for Responsible Investment. From a global compact perspective, we've got the CFO principles on integrated SDG investments and finance. There are so many different initiatives out there and guidance out there now, and it can obviously be quite confusing. But what are those key challenges? And I guess ultimately, how do you hold investment managers or heads of responsible investment to account? So I might just start with you, Liza, and then I'll work backwards.
Yeah, great question. And thanks for that. Look, I think, I used to say I'm head of responsible investments, not to say that everyone else is irresponsible in our investment team. So it's sort of, you've got to look at it. I think the work we did on the SDGs, actually, so ESG integration, our investment team sort of, they got that. When we came to the SDGs, they just kind of looked at me really blankly. And it was kind of like, you've got all these terms. You've got ESG, we're members of the GISD, which is the global, it's a Global Investors Alliance for Sustainable Development. There's all these acronyms and all these different frameworks. Yeah. and they were confused. And I'm like going, yeah, okay, I can understand that. So how do we get our investment teams on board in terms of thinking about their investment approach? So we spent a lot of time with them all going, what are the SDGs? What do they mean? What are all of our different frameworks, even our impact measurement framework, and how they all sat together? And what it ultimately led to, and it was a fantastic education process from our perspective. We talk about this all the time. We are always sort of, referencing all these things, but doesn't necessarily mean it's understood by our investment teams. So how do we bring them along on this journey, and how do we explain it? And when you sit down and break it down, they're kind of like, oh, okay, so we have this GP, they're investing in, say, healthcare technology. Oh, they're doing this, and sort of really breaking it down to, well, what's the investment theme that you've got? What are the GPs that you're looking for? How you're trying to allocate your capital to those managers? And why would we allocate capital to a manager who doesn't understand what our values and alignment and what SDGs are? And how do we bring them on the journey as well? So it's not easy. And this is just our PE team that we've probably spent the last 8 months with, in kind of bringing them along to think about how they can invest in line with the SDGs. One thing we have done is give our portfolio managers targets, and I don't want to say targets quite loosely, because it is all about it from a return perspective. They're going to find the investments to meet the return profile that we have for the fund, but they've got certain SDG aligned targets where they have to allocate capital that meets our SDG alignment, and we get involved to kind of tell them what does and doesn't meet, sort of looking at the sub indicators, etc. But it's changed their thinking in how they approach their investment portfolio and what they're looking for. And I think that's a real win for the whole of the industry in terms of how we are thinking about allocating capital.
Yeah. And Måns, would you agree with that if you had similar, I guess, challenges and undertaken a similar approach at Ausbil?
Yeah, no, I think, I agree with many of those points. In order for me to explain the challenges, I probably have to outline briefly how I do things as well. So it might be take a while, but please cut me off if I go too long. But I think if I look at the SDGs, there's two aspects of that. One is the integration in the investment process. The other part is engagement. And personally, I think as an active manager like we are, the main impact we can have is actually through engagement. If I start off with the investment process, well, there is a link between ESG in general and SDGs. We have our own internal proprietary ESG research function. So the ESG research we do is part of the investment process, and therefore implicitly, I guess you could say the SDGs are part of that too. And then we have a dedicated ESG fund, active sustainable fund, where we screen out certain companies from our investable universe. A number of those companies that are screened out are actually negatively aligned with SDGs. So that's another sort of indirect link, I guess. And then in the investment process, then we have a proprietary stock ranking tool where 25% of the input comes from ESG industry scores, 25% from the ESG company scores, and I'll explain what they are. So industry scores are basically the scores we set for a company in the environment they're operating. So that's the geopolitical risk, operational ESG risk, demographic factors, and also alignment with SDGs. So there is a formal link there, I guess, as one out of many factors we look at when we set the scores. But there are practical challenges, which I'm happy to talk more about later on. But I just want to make the point that integration, we can talk about that a lot, but I think engagement is really where we as an active manager can play a big role. And to me, it's sort of similar to the Modern Slavery Act too. I can spend all my time identifying the risk, mapping out our portfolio, but really I'm not going to move the dial on that. Where we move the dial is actually by engaging with companies, encouraging them to take steps to actually improve. So we have an annual engagement plan. We make a reference to the SDGs, but again, we don't sort of align our engagement with SDGs per se. We don't measure the outcomes according to the SDGs, but of course, there's a lot of alignment between them. Yeah. In terms of the challenges, I see there's a lot of practical things which you go into. But one of them I've heard of, which I don't really agree with, is that if you buy companies in the markets, then you automatically just joining someone else's good efforts. You're actually not part of the impact. And I think it can be true if you're just a passive investor, you just hold those shares for a while and you're in and out. But if you hold those shares for a while and you're actually engaging directly with the company, I certainly think investors can have a big role to play. I'm happy to elaborate more on the practical challenges. There's quite a few actually when you actually do it in practice.
Yeah, I might just hand over to Nicole first, and then we can unpack those a bit further. But, Nicole, you're obviously, involved with a superannuation fund that is an industry fund and therefore member driven. So do you agree with Måns in terms of the importance of stakeholder engagement being a really top priority in your approach?
Yeah, look, there's a couple of elements to that. I think more broadly, the way we look at this is because our board is so engaged and we do have the experience of learning by doing, as I would say, through Cbus property, it does give us permission to work on these issues and allocate resources at a management level, because really when you're driving change in this area, it is about the people. We can talk about the challenges of data and other things, but you need to win people and their hearts and minds. And so in 2016, our board approved, for example, a climate change position statement. And from that, we were able to, as I mentioned, allocate resources, but also develop a climate change roadmap. And what that did is it guided our implementation and really holds us to account, but not me to account for my team. It's broadly the investments team and the total portfolio to account for how we look at these issues. Because if it was left to our team to solve alone, then we wouldn't get anything done because we just don't have the capacity to do it. And it needs to be part of the investment decision making, which both Liza and Måns have already touched on as well. Now, I think in terms of just a couple of examples for us, when we've thought about the climate change and implementing our roadmap, we're up to our second roadmap, and we've been able to set targets at the portfolio, as I mentioned. Now, to be able to be genuine and look at our 45% target by 2030, what did that look like? That's involved the asset allocation team, the analytics team, and of course the investments team thinking about this, not just from an asset class perspective, but also a sector perspective where there's data available, because you need to look at this more broadly from a matrix element. So it goes to that total portfolio, and it's what can we do then across the different strategies as well. So if you're looking at a quant strategy, that's very different at looking at a listed equity strategy from an implementation perspective. So our quant team, what they've gone away and done is basically they use models to invest. So they determine the parameters around how they invest. And one of the metrics that we've identified, and we did it collectively as between our team and our quant team, was a stranded asset metric that they have incorporated into their quant models. And what that means is when their models are buying companies in listed equities, that they're not going to invest in companies that we think may become asset stranding, and all that's done automatically. Whereas if we're looking at it from a listed equity perspective, then it's very much, okay, we're active either directly ourselves looking at the stocks and building out the portfolio, or we're doing it through fund managers such as Måns and Ausbil. And what our expectations are is that they're taking these issues into account in how they make those investment decisions directly. And then of course it comes back to engagement and making sure that we are using our influence to also influence the companies in which we invest and where our members' savings are invested. Now, going back to your question around the broader stakeholders, so it is driven from a top-down perspective. It's important that we engage with our investments team, our fund managers equally, but we've also surveyed our members, and I'm happy to talk more about that on the responsible investment lens, what it means for them and what's important to them as well. Because as Liza pointed out, likewise and similar to Aware Super, we've thought about this more broadly from a membership base around what's important to our members, although we're accountable for making sure that we still deliver returns, we deliver those risk-adjusted returns for them, because that is ultimately our sole purpose.
Sorry, that's great. Thank you. Did Liza or Måns, do you have anything to add to that, or are you happy to move on?
I might just add some very practical complexities. Like, yeah. I'm just talking from the perspective of an investment manager focusing on Australian companies only, listed companies. I mean, one thing is, which Liza talked about before, most of these SDGs, of course, relate developing countries, and it can be difficult to actually find those companies in the listed space which have a positive impact. And often you find the companies which have the highest theoretical impact, probably being mining companies and energy companies. But then you also need to weigh up, the environmental degradation that comes from that. And it's not always straightforward. If you look at the materiality as well, where do you draw the line of what is a positive contribution to the SDGs in terms of revenue? Is it 1% of the revenue? Is it 10%? You need to net them out against each other too. So if you have a thermal coal company, for instance, which might do wonderful thing to the local community, but on the other hand, they're contributing to climate change. And I know where I sit in that if I net them out, but someone else might disagree. So there's no rule around that. We sort of comes back to one of my bugbears, which is probably the unfortunate situation that there's no one really policing the SDGs and how that's used in terms of communication. Because I've seen companies that have said, well, we target all the 17 SDGs. And there is a risk of greenwashing, which I think can undermine the SDGs, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah.
And a broader challenge too, I guess, is just the fact that we got less than 10 years to solve some of these issues. And you know this very well too, Kylie, with modern slavery, for instance, that's increased in magnitude and prevalence, and same thing with poverty due to COVID. So those are some of the practical challenges from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think we've the three of us, well, four of us should say, sorry, have talked about this before around, you can pull a positive lever on one SDG and it can lead to an equally negative lever on another one. And it goes quite strongly into the next question around how does this translate to your discussion with stakeholders, and particularly with companies. We're seeing we've obviously heard from the board session before this one around the ASX governance principles and the need to have more of an ethical view around companies. We know that generational shifts have influenced how people are viewing their superannuation. We see social bonds and resilience bonds, and I'm hoping that the coming up generation who have just started out in the workforce are more aware of their superannuation investments and more aware of investments more broadly. So I guess thinking about that, when you're having these discussions about companies and with companies or with other stakeholders, and you're recognizing the disparity that's being caused, like to what extent are companies basing their decisions not only on their own future investments, but also on the expectations that are placed on them by this more, I guess, ESG aware public? So Nicole, do you want to start with that one, and then I'll go to Liza and Måns?
Yeah, sure. I just probably a little shift. We talk about companies and we're talking about the listed market space. It'd be good to just touch on what we're seeing in the private market space as well, and unlisted companies, because it does equally apply. Just to give a perspective of our portfolio, 50% of it's invested in equities, both in Australia and internationally, but also equally we have a lot of other different types of investments. Over 10% of our investments are in property. We have the same and similar amount in infrastructure, fixed income, etc. Now, the way we look at it, I think one of the points is that you've got to know where you can use your influence. And an example of that is around the decent work and economic growth. Now, we're very fortunate on the Cbus property side that we have 100% ownership. So it's very easy when you're in that situation, but that's not always the case. Now, in that situation, we've used or Cbus property has been measuring the job creation for over a decade now on Cbus property, because we do think it's important to identify how we can look at it from an economic growth perspective. And thus far, they've generated about 100,000 jobs, direct jobs over that time. But what we're looking at now is how do we take this and apply it more broadly to the portfolio, because it is really challenging because we don't own 100% of everything else. So we're looking at meaningful ways to do that, because that particular methodology that we use is developed by an external party and it's also assured by an external party. So it is a very genuine, particular approach that's used. So for us, it goes back to that data point around how do we come up with verifiable and meaningful ways to identify these outcomes in investments for what we contribute to. But in terms of other areas, so we've started to think about the decent work element more broadly from an infrastructure perspective, because how we invest is both ourselves and directly, but also through external fund managers, as I mentioned with Måns. Now, when we're looking at directly, for example, infrastructure, that's something that's new for us over the last 3 years. So how can we use our influence and what we've learned from Cbus property to bring it into this industry? And particularly when we're investing in greenfield development, take renewables, for example, making sure that the work created is decent work in the new economy, because we often focus on the just transition side and moving away from fossil fuels, but also what does that look like in the new economy? And being, I think, particularly deliberate about that as well. So in large scale construction, the focus is often about the cost minimisation, but there are potential financial, reputational impacts around supply chains, the contracted terms, and really the construction outcomes from not considering these types of issues. So overall, it can delay projects and impact your investments overall. So from that perspective, we've been developing a contractor protocol that we can use to influence both the assets in which we invest and also the external fund managers. So we've been sharing it with us as well. So we take the position of being transparent in how we interact with these stakeholders and these parties, because we do recognise that there needs to be a shift from delivering these sustainable, high-performing outcomes to projects that are delivered on time within budget, but also make sure that it's appropriate for the workforce in which they're being developed. So we've taken the learnings of a contractor protocol that we use at Cbus Property, and we've applied it to our infrastructure investments. But going back to your other point on stakeholders, this has been developed by our infrastructure team, and because they're on the ground making the investments decisions, they have the relationships with these assets, with the boards, with management. So they're being able to develop that with our guidance and implement that more broadly across their investments.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Nicole. That's really helpful. Liza?
Yeah, thanks. There's a lot in all of this, isn't there, in terms of how we think about it. So I know there's some companies that are listening in today and picking up on that listed and unlisted aspect. So to date, from an Aware Super perspective, in terms of our SDG alignment or thinking about how we can invest in line with the SDGs, we have focused on the unlisted or private markets. And we've seen, and that's been a deliberate strategy around the fact that we know more capital needs to be deployed to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. So that intentionality and additionality from actually allocating capital either through our private equity managers or through some of our infrastructure or direct assets is how we have approached it in terms of looking for those investments and aligning them to the SDGs. So there's certain metrics and targets that we have, and whether it be affordable housing or climate change, we felt that for our investment team, that was really easy for them to understand and be able to sort of, do. When we looked at the listed space, and, really happy to be challenged on this, and there's lots of debate around listed companies and their contribution to the SDGs, I think companies really need to step back and have a look at what their purpose is, what they're actually trying to achieve from their business and what their product does or what their operations does, and that holistic view. And instead of going, we meet all 17 SDGs because we do that, think about what your business strategy is and the positive impact that your product or service may actually be having on the environment and society, and tell that story and educate or disclose to your investors and to to your stakeholders in terms of what your purpose is. We did some work, and completely off topic, around long-term value creation. We want to invest in companies that are long-term. We went through the ASX. How many had a stated purpose beyond just profitability or, sort of shareholder return? Not a lot. So what we want to see is listed companies thinking about what their purpose is. The fact that you make bottled water does not mean you meet an SDG. It's that how you are actually changing your business practices to contribute to those SDGs, and whether it's, you know, focus on one, you know, let's drive change on one and really think about what you can do to solve for those. I also think we forget SDG 17 around partnerships for the goals. Yeah. I think for an investor, that is a critical SDG that we can all get on board with and all sort of contribute in our own way through actually elevating how we think about SDGs.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox now, sorry.
No, totally agree with the soapbox. And yeah, SDG 17 from a UN Global Compact perspective, that's one of our lead and shape SDGs. And it's vital. You can't make the changes that need to be made to reach the goals, you know, before 2030 without partnerships. So it's a good reminder. We have a lot of questions coming through the Q&A function, and I'm just going to take them in order of the ones that have been voted most highly. So the first question is whether you rely on third-party research providers to supply the data on listed companies' SDG performance, and whether a company is positively or negatively contributing to them. And if so, what provider? And if not, surely this takes up a lot of time and resource to track. So who would like to answer that one first? Måns, do you want to start with that one?
Sure. Yeah, so at Ausbil, we do our own proprietary EC research. That's myself and one other person, General Morrison. We cover ASX 200 companies. We don't really use any third-party providers other than if there's occasionally we might buy climate change data or carbon data from a third-party provider, and we also have a proxy advisor. The rest of it we do ourselves. And I went through briefly how we did the assessment before, and you know, we only factor in where there's a very clear case that a company is either positively or negatively aligned with SDGs. That's how we do it. We don't really see the need for that detailed, like extremely detailed work. And it comes back to what I said before, like, you know, if you really want to make an impact, yes, you can spend a lot of time on the analysis and, you know, the nitty-gritty of exposures, but really where you make a difference, I think, is for engagement. And that's where we want to spend most of our time.
Yeah, absolutely. Nicole?
And yeah, I'd love to respond to that one because it really does highlight the difference between being a fund manager as well and often being a super fund, because to give context to this, and for example, we invest in close to 4,000 listed companies. So there's absolutely no way we could do it ourselves, and we'd never have a team big enough. So yes, we use third-party service providers, and that's why we use third-party service providers for a number of things. So from an engagement perspective, which is obviously important from both an ESG and an SDG lens, for ESG data service providers and proxy voting as well. Now, I think what's really interesting is what we've seen over time in terms of the development. And sorry, I'll go back to the question around the which ones we use. We're currently going through a review at the moment on looking at what this means from an equity portfolio, because going back to Lisa's point, it's really hard to know if companies, going back to that point about being genuine, the additionality, the intention on both products and their operations. So it's really hard to know what that looks like. And so you do need to use third-party service providers for public markets. We don't for private markets. We do it ourselves, and we've got much better control over that and understanding it, as I've described what we've done on other parts of our investment and private markets. So on the listed equity side, we're going through a review at the moment, and some of the challenges for us, well, firstly, we've got a large portfolio. Secondly, that all the data providers are different and not one answers a particular question that you're trying to solve for. So are you trying to measure the outcomes? Are you using it for investment decision-making purposes? So is it going into one of your strategies? Are you going to use it from a metrics perspective into, say, a quant strategy? Or are you looking at through a risk lens? So we're going through trying to answer all these questions on the listed equity side, and not one service provider answers all these questions. So, you know, it's going to be a trade-off in terms of where we land on this particular point. But I think what's interesting, and it goes back to what Liza was saying earlier on the listed equity side, that there's been research over time on what companies are doing and their disclosures on the SDG, which is obviously reflecting what they're doing. So I know in Australia, ACSI did a report. They do a report annually on companies and reporting on broader sustainability and ESG. And in 2019, there was 43% of the ASX 200 were using the SDGs as a framework, which had doubled in a year, which is amazing. Now, what we're seeing also out of Europe is that, say more broadly globally, is that companies are also reporting on the SDGs as a framework. More companies globally proportionally than in Australia, what we understand, but very few are articulating this through what it means for their strategy and risk management, going again back to Lisa's point, and just over 5% provide metrics. So this is what makes it really challenging. If companies aren't disclosing metrics and measuring their outcomes and intentionality and additionality, it makes it very hard then for investors to do the same, because we rely on this bottom-up data generated that then is often used by the service providers as well to be able to look at our portfolios and make investment decisions in a meaningful way. Yeah. So it goes back to that whole ESG discussion that we've been having, that we need data, we need quality data. It's no different from an SDG perspective as well. And that's really where the evolution needs to occur.
Yeah, thanks, Nicole. Liza, I might direct the next question to you about, when you're looking at company performance, how do you balance the need for profits and returns with the need to invest or meet, ESG, SDGs, to improve footprint? And, perhaps we can tie that back to some of the comments in the chat function earlier around donut economics and the need to think about things from a more regenerative perspective.
Yeah, look, I don't think there is a difference. I think that companies that are sustainable and that are focused on the long term and focused on how they're actually, going to be sustainable and bringing that whole, environment, social and profit, purpose and profit have to be intertwined. So we don't separate them out. The way we sort of think about looking at companies or assessing companies is are they performing? What's their strategy? And how are they bringing in the environment and the society into their strategy as well? So they're not separated out in any way. And I think it's really important that, we talk about whether we're investing in line with SDGs or we're investing in line with RI or ESG. There's no compromise on returns in how we think about it. First and foremost, we're there to invest, to deliver a return to our members. And that is how we think about it.
Yeah, I might even add, it comes back to fiduciary duty, right? Just like Liza said. Sustainability factors are increasing importance. Yep. We need to take them into account to make the best returns we can for our clients. In simple terms, for a stock picking firm like the oil investment manager like Ausbil, we try to avoid the companies that we think will be a disadvantage from ESG factors in the long, going forward, and equally try to find opportunities for those are positively aligned. There's a lot of themes out there, like the decarbonisation, etc., where you can actually find companies that are providing a solution, and I think that's ultimately where the SDGs is very strongly aligned in terms of finding companies that provide the solutions for the global challenges. And having been in ESG research for 14 years, which is probably why I've got grey hairs, the whole importance of ESG has just increasingly it's become such a big thing in the last couple of years, and it's really, the world is changing, right? So companies that don't follow these trends, well, they're going to do so at their own peril. I think that's what it comes down to.
And so then how do you all deal with the trade-off? So, one of the questions was, obviously the increasing investment in PPE companies, which links directly to good health and, making sure that we've got the right products or the right tools out there to help combat modern slavery to combat COVID, with then the trade-off of an increased use of, increased waste, potential for increased modern slavery, as we've seen with some PPE providers. So I guess it goes back to what we talked about earlier, where, you pull a trigger on one and it can have a negative, trigger on the other. So how do you balance that when you're looking at decisions or making decisions?
Yeah, I think I might just point out, we have not skewed or put, how do I want to say this? We've not skewed our portfolio to make sure it is all investing in line with SDGs. That's not how we've approached it. So it's very much, we own everything. Okay. the first to acknowledge that we are a universal owner, we own the index, we will own everything. I think engagement is the key. It is absolutely all about engagement. We know, I mean, we've been doing a lot of work on modern slavery, and it's really about, you know, the supply chain and the links, and you know, there's been some evidence to say that, you know, we're all investing in solar, and it's fantastic, but there's links to some of the components that's going into all of the solar that we're investing in coming out of particular regions where there's modern slavery. How do we balance that up? Engagement. We need to understand the companies we're investing in. We need to understand the supply chain, and we need to get better at that, because we will inevitably own all of this across our portfolio.
Yeah, and just to add a minor point to that as well, I absolutely agree with Lisa. We are universal owners, and this is why the SDGs are so important to us, because it will drive future economic growth. But I think in terms of the positive and the negative impacts, what we don't see a lot of is reporting of the negative side and the impact to our investments. So it's very hard for us to be able to articulate that in any particular way at the moment. But similar to Lisa, we haven't directed our portfolio to be investing in the Sustainable Development Goals. We take it into account in how we think about issues, depending on the type of strategy and asset class, and how it relates to the portfolio more broadly.
Yeah, thank you. We've got time for a final question. This is one around interested to understand what you see as the greatest barrier that your organisations are facing to hold you back from achieving your SDG goals and broader SDG contribution. So interested from a learning or sharing perspective. So perhaps you can all give us an insight into an either internal or external barrier that you think needs to be shifted in order to allow us to meet the SDGs. I'll start with you, Nicole.
I think I've touched on a fair few of the challenges in the portfolio. I think the directionality that we look at is always towards Europe, and to see what they're doing, particularly around the regulatory side, the EU taxonomy, how they're thinking about disclosures. And on all those points, from an EU taxonomy perspective, starting to categorise companies on green or brown and their contributions, and being meaningful about that. They're very, very particular about how that, what that looks like. But also the do no harm concept, because what we're seeking to achieve is to minimise that negative impact of the investments, you know, those trade-offs. So what does that look like? And I think that's still under evolution, and you can see that in Europe, that they haven't solved for this either. So it is going to be a constant ongoing challenge that we face. But importantly, one of the other elements that we're focused on is disclosure, and it's disclosure from the asset owners, the fund managers, the companies, private markets. It's the supply chain, and that's why it's been welcome, things like the modern slavery regulation, because it's not necessarily specific to private markets, because there is an opacity problem, particularly in the private market space, where we're not always getting this data to the extent, or this information to the extent that we need. So making sure these concepts are broadly applied across companies generally as well.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Nicole. Måns?
Yeah, so similar to Nicole and Lisa, we don't sort of align our portfolios with SDGs. I just want to make that clear as well. Very similar to what they just said. Yeah, I think I've touched on most of the practical complexities that I see. I think greenwashing is one of them. Like I'd really like to see a robust and honest conversation about the SDGs. I think that is a barrier, and I think that that's a risk that's going to undermine the whole concept of SDGs. But other than that, just thinking what other key challenges I haven't mentioned. I think I mentioned all of them actually. And data is part of it. And obviously, if I was covering 4,000 companies like Nicole in a portfolio, I would not do this myself. I would also use a third-party provider, and I would also have the same issues.
Yeah. Lisa?
I might turn it the other way around. And I think, we can sit here and go, there's challenges, there's barriers, there's that, but let's try and embrace and get through it. I think, the positive side is that for a number, and particularly for Aware Super, we have a board that is supportive, we have members that are supportive, and we need to find a way to be able to do this. So, it has taken us 5 years to invest in affordable housing, to make it stack up from an investment perspective. It's not that we didn't want to do it, but it really had to meet the investment profile that we were looking for. But once we got there, there's no stopping us now. It's kind of, there's that real motivation now to think about, well, what's next? How do we break through those barriers, and how do we make sure we can invest to create a positive world? When we did climate change and put out a strategy, there's lots of people saying, oh, that's fantastic, because you can give us all the retirement savings in the world, but if we don't have a world to live in, what's the point? So there's a real kind of, I think our members, our communities are going to put a lot more pressure on investors, and particularly their super funds, in how they are investing their capital. And so we need to break that down. And there are so many challenges, definitions, frameworks, multiple different things. But, for the funds or even companies that are there, start small. Just, start small. Think about where you can do something, and start the journey.